Hello everyone. My name is Taylor Reynolds from the OECD and I'll be moderating the session today. I wanted to thank you for coming. I know that this wasn't easy. We were not supposed to be running parallel with the final session of the IGF before, so we do appreciate that you've taken the time to come. You've stepped away from the final session to talk about some of the key documents that we think have come out of the OECD that could help with internet policymaking. I'd like to start today, first of all, by giving you a little background on the OECD's recommendations that we'll be talking about. And then I'd like to devote roughly 20 to 25 minutes to each of the three recommendations today. So if I can just quickly start with the first slide, I want to introduce the panelists we have today. When they take the floor for the first time, I will ask each panelist if they can introduce themselves, give a little brief explanation, maybe one or two sentences stating where you work and what you've been focusing on. And the same goes for any participant around the table who takes the stand and would like to speak, if you could introduce yourselves. So we have a great group ahead of us. We've got Nigel Hickson from ICANN. We've got Mr. Toru Nakaya from Japan, from MIC, from the Ministry of Communications. We have Sam Paltridge from the OECD. We have Rohan Samarajiva from Learn Asia. And we have Valerie Tan from Microsoft. So I think we're going to have an interesting discussion today. I would like to keep this relatively informal because of the size of the number of people here. And I think we can have some interesting discussions about what these principles, what these recommendations mean, and how they can feed into overall policy making. So I think the first thing I probably need to explain is what a recommendation is. But even before that, what is the OECD? So the OECD is a group of 34 member countries that's based in Paris, and we do economic policy making, essentially. So a recommendation, we're talking about today 3 recommendations that have been, that's our highest instrument in the OECD, and we have 3 of these that are tied, that fit very well with the IGF. So what is a recommendation that comes out of the OECD? What does this mean? Well, first of all, a recommendation is a document and a set of principles that comes out of a multi-stakeholder process at the OECD. At the OECD, we meet together with member countries, we meet with the internet technical community, with the business community, and with civil society. And we work on policy issues that eventually bubble up to become a draft recommendation and then a full-fledged recommendation at the OECD. Now, a recommendation is not legally binding. We call this soft law because it's a recommendation, it's not a law. But it does carry some weight within the OECD system because any council recommendation needs to be unanimously agreed upon by the OECD Council. And the OECD Council is made up of 34 ambassadors from OECD member countries, plus an ambassador from the European Union. So, so these are extremely important documents for us, and they reflect a lot of work that's been done in a multi-stakeholder way. So the 3 recommendations that I would like to speak about today are, first, Principles for Internet Policymaking. This came out in December 2011, and this I think is the core piece of work that's been discussed here at the IGF over the past essentially two different years. Then we'll talk about protection of children online, and finally we'll end with a recommendation on international mobile roaming services that was also published in 2012. So to begin with, I'd like to talk about the Internet Policy Principles. There are 14 key principles that are part of the Internet Policy Principles. This was a piece of work that took, I think, roughly 2 years to put together in the OECD and fed out of a ministerial that the OECD held in Seoul in 2008. So what I've done, I'm not going to read through all of these, but I'm going to pick a couple of the Internet Policy Principles here. There's 14, and just give you a feeling for what's in these principles. So for example, uh, one of the key principles is that we want to promote and protect the free flow of information. We talk about the importance of an open and distributed internet. Everything we talk about the fundamental importance of multi-stakeholderism, and that we need to voluntarily develop codes of conduct. If you can go next slide. We think that internet policy needs to be transparent, it needs to be fair, and there needs to be accountability. We think security and privacy needs to be at the forefront when policymakers are thinking about internet policy. Again, we talk about individual empowerment, about creativity and innovation, and that we think we should limit internet intermediary liability. Finally, to end off, we have encourage cooperation to promote internet security, and we think there needs to be priority given to enforcement efforts. So this is a brief list of some of the internet policy principles that came out of the OECD, and they've been discussed here. What I'd like to do is open the floor to some of our panelists who have done some work, actually fed into the process to create the OECD policy principles, and also potentially have put these into practice or have worked with these and can give us some feedback on what these are about. So maybe if I can open this up, if there's a panelist who'd like to take the floor first and suggest. If not, Nigel, would you mind? Thank you.
Oops, let's get nearer. Good morning. Good morning. Can you hear me? Yeah. It's very odd, isn't it, this microphone system? I mean, it's not that I like hearing my own voice, but you have no confidence when you're on the microphone that other people can hear you. But anyway, I'll just keep on. Well, good morning. I'm Nigel Hickson. Not that that's relevant. I work for ICANN. ICANN is well, you know what ICANN is. So I won't explain it too much. I work in Brussels. I'm the Vice President for Europe and the Middle East, based in Brussels. I was with the UK government for a long time, and so I have a great respect, affinity for the OECD. I think the OECD have done incredible work in this area. The Internet policy principles, I think, are an example of the work that the OECD has done, but there's been much good work done before on a number of fronts. So I think there's two important aspects to this. First of all, there's the important aspect that the OECD have done this work, and then there's the principles themselves. And if we could go on the first aspect first, because for ICANN, the importance is not that these principles, if you like, have just come out of the OECD, is what happens to these principles. Because although only 34 countries, if you like, are in the OECD and thus have signed up to these principles, we truly believe that these principles should be global in nature. And if you read the whole of the recommendation, in addition to including the Internet policy principles, also gives a responsibility on member states to disseminate them throughout their own communities. So we shouldn't just, as governments, like when I was with the UK, we shouldn't just be signing up to these principles and saying, yes, they're good principles. We should be disseminating them in our community. And what's more, we should be taking them into other fora. We should be taking these principles and say, look, these are principles which we believe in. We should be passionate about these principles. And in being passionate about these principles, the fundamental thing I want to say in terms of what we should do with these principles is that we should put them on the table in Dubai. At the ITU Wicket discussion, we should say, these are the principles we believe in. This is what's really important. These are the principles which we think should govern our behavior, our attitude, our whole ethos in terms of the internet. And you know, I don't get passionate about this, but I think it is important, because I think the discussion in Dubai is crying out for something positive. The Secretary General this week was very open, saying he wants an open discussion. He wants to promote investment. He wants to promote broadband penetration. He personally has done so much work in setting up the Broadband Commission. These principles help with investment and economic growth. The OECD wouldn't have approved them, wouldn't have done all the work that Taylor and his colleagues have done if they didn't. These principles are an opportunity to take the internet into every home, to take the internet to every citizen. So I think we have to take them seriously. I think we have to work on them. And if you look at the individual principles, I think they all have a relevance for what we're discussing in Dubai. I'm not saying they need to be copied out exactly, and of course you'd want to look at each one to see how relevant it is. But I think if these principles are truly going to make the difference that they should make, and the 34 member states that signed up to them wanted them to make, then we have to take them global. And I'll stop there. But thank you for this opportunity.
I'm going to pass over to Roanne.
I do not come from inside within the OECD. I run a think tank that works in emerging Asia. And when we look at the WICIT proposals in specific, I'm going to be very specific, the Arab states proposal, which is formulated and which has been officially published, I see that there are contradictions with several of these principles, but in particular I'd like to focus on the fourth principle, because I have spoken earlier at IGF on the contradictions between this sending party network pays kinds of ideas. And I want to assure you that even though ethno uses that language, those ideas are embodied in proposals coming out of the African states and the Arab states. So it's not limited to ethno. But particularly 4, which is promote and enable cross-border delivery of services, which is potentially in conflict with the great progress that has been made in getting certain kinds of disciplines in place with regard to trade in services. So, for example, the Arab states are proposing that each member state should have the right to authorize entities located outside the national territory which are providing services within. And this is where all these ICT services comes in. So basically they should be licensing Google or Yahoo or whoever. That's one implication of the definitions that have been proposed. And another one, of course, is that whole idea that when these charges are levied, access charges as they are called, you could have a situation where mode 1 trade, that is where the buyer and the seller are in different locations, where telecommunications is, or the entire internet platform is absolutely critical, is affected. And furthermore, that the moratorium that has been placed on regulating, interfering with e-commerce globally could also be affected. I'll stop at that point.
Do we have any other questions or comments? Yep.
Thank you, Mr. Reynolds. I am Toru Nakaya. I'm from the Japanese government, and I'm now the head of Research Institute of the MIC. But I worked for the ministry itself and used to in charge of the international policy coordination on ICT up to this September. I was in charge of ITU, UN, and also IGF. And let me make comments on each the intervention from the panelists. First, I fully support what those previous speakers said. And in particular, the contradiction of Arab group is, let's say, we have to introduce at WCIT. But on the other hand, I believe WICIT, WCIT, is not appropriate fora to discuss internet policy. From the outset, I put stress that this is a conference for reviewing treaty on telecommunications and not to discuss internet policy or internet issues, that will lead to adopting a resolution which is not legally binding. WICIT is a forum to revise a particular treaty which stipulates something on telecommunications, in particular international telecommunications. And it is closed to governments and sector members. It's impossible to open that discussion to multi-stakeholders because the rules of procedure was already set in the plenipot, which is out of the scope of WICIT. So I have felt a bit strange feeling that many stakeholders looked at WICIT and go there to discuss internet. Why we should do that? Even though they go there, there's no opportunity to incorporate their voice into the real discussion. Maybe they can have some side meetings or have a lobby to delegates. It's possible. But if they make big voice, we have to expect more repercussion from those member states who opt for government regulation. So I still have a bit of concern. If we raise a big voice in WCIT on internet, we got more and more repercussion from those countries who opt for government regulation. Rather, we should say that ITU, or let's say WCIT, is not appropriate for to discuss internet policy. So let's neglect and ask governments to concentrate on telecommunications discussion so that we can have another fora to discuss internet policy freely. And maybe we could have it in WTPF next year or in follow-up process of WSIS. So rather than supporting his idea on bringing that principles into WCIT, I would suggest that we should bring these principles into United Nations, in particular the second committee discussion, which is currently going on in New York. They are the ones who make the decision on this follow-up process. They are the ones how the enhanced cooperation should be discussed in the framework of UN. And they're taking the decision by the end of this year in parallel of WICIT. So from my point of view, the second committee of the UN is more important than WICIT. WICIT will do something about internet, but it is really, really difficult. If you look at current ITR, there are many, many reservations. And even though they are adopted, revisions are adopted, and even though it is said that ITR is legally binding, if you look at those stipulations, or let's say the wordings, word by word, they are written in a way that it could be voluntarily applied. Each provision carries where possible or where technically feasible. That means if member states doesn't have to follow, if it is not technically impossible, or it is technically impossible from their point of view. And if US government put reservations on the revised ITR, that's nothing, you see? So for the time being, USA or USA delegation has a big power on revision of ITR. So even a majority of states opt for regulating internet on ITR. If USA delegation put a statement and says, we reserve the right to not to follow these provisions, then that's over. So I think we shouldn't exaggerate the existence of WICIT anymore. Rather, we should put more stress, or we should look at the current discussion on the second committee of the United Nations. That's my point. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We had some very good and strong interventions there. I would like to take the time and open this up because I think this is a very rich discussion, a rich vein of discussion. I would like to open this up for any comments coming from other participants in the room. If you've got ideas or things you'd like to share, I'll open it up. Open up to the floor. Is there anyone who'd like to comment? If not, in the meantime, if I can just quickly bring something up. I was in the panel in the final session here just before coming to this meeting, and there was someone who stood up and said, well, you know, it's great that groups like the OECD, Council of Europe are putting these things together, but, you know, they're a small group of stakeholders and this and that maybe this needs to go to a larger audience. I would argue that the process that we've gone through has opened this up in a multi-stakeholder way to civil society. We actually had non-OECD countries that signed on to the Internet Policy Principles. For example, we had Costa Rica and Egypt. Other countries are welcome to join. What I think the OECD added in terms of value here is bringing people together, coming up with a very well thought out set of policy principles that then it can offer to the world as one large group. So I'd be interested in hearing how you think these types of principles that are created this way can actually be disseminated to groups that are beyond the borders of, for example, the traditional 34 OECD countries. Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
Hi. I can't hear myself, but I presume that everyone can hear me. I have the same problem as Nigel. My name is Valerie Tan, and I work for Microsoft. I'm based out of Singapore, and I largely cover the Asia-Pacific region, looking at internet and some telecom policy issues. Before I joined Microsoft this year, I was working for Skype. And following the acquisition earlier this year, I'm now part of the wider Microsoft family. Fantastic. I've spent 10 years before Skype in the telecom sector, and a couple of observations just wanted to make of the OECD Internet Policy Principles. Firstly, I think they're just more than principles. They're actually best practice principles, because if you look at the countries that have participated and also private sector that has been involved in the formulation of these principles, they actually enshrine what successful information society economies have actually done locally. So these principles are really best practice principles that can be disseminated even beyond the OECD economies, especially, you know, through the process of regional groupings. I think this is a very important year for internet policy also, because it, you know, leads up, not the least because it leads up to the wicked discussions. And just want to draw on my colleague from the Japanese government, his point that wicked may not be the most appropriate place to discuss the issues of internet, which boils down to the very fact that the internet is a really open architecture, and its openness is what has created a lot of that innovation and enterprise from having the internet being an open architecture. The fact that wicked will happen, actually, it's not, you know, something we can say that internet or telecoms are two, you know, distinct and different industries or sectors at this point in time, because of the phenomenon of convergence. So the fact that the OECD has taken this opportunity to put through these set of principles through really largely a multi-stakeholder process is something that, you know, we would like to really commend the OECD for its great efforts. And if OECD economies could, through their participation at regional groupings, so for example in Asia, there are various regional groupings like the ASEAN Council and the APEC. That would be a channel to facilitate and, you know, disseminate these best practice principles.
Thank you very much, Valerie, for that input. Are there any other comments? Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Reynolds. I have two observations. The firstly, I don't think WICIT is well, IGF type nor WICIS type conference. The conference will be carried out in a way stipulated in the rules of procedure, and their task is to negotiate text of treaty and not exchange an idea on internet or telecommunications. If they directly got into a discussion on text, and if they spent some time for discussing ideas freely, I truly believe that WICIT will be in a failure, because WICIT has only 10 days to work, and they have to come out concrete text in 6 languages on the last day of WICIT. That means that they have substantially 8 days or 7 days to work on a text, and they have to leave 2 or 3 days for translation and to make correction, to correct grammatical errors. And as she pointed out, it's a bit difficult to distinguish between telecommunication and ICT. I fully agree. On the other hand, the current WICIT is based on IT constitution and convention, which does not carry any word of IT or ICT or internet. So if we try to limit the scope, it's possible. And if we open up the debate to internet, it will probably invite anybody to jump on discussion on internet. So rather, I believe that it is better to have governments focus on discussion on telecommunications on WICIT. Of course, there are many governments which want to discuss on internet policy. But still, we have to take an approach that WICIT should focus on discussion on telecommunications. And my second comment is with regard to OECD, the branding. I fully support that OECD did a tremendous job and tremendous work, and the result was wonderful. However, if we mention the brand of OECD, we always receive some criticism from developing countries, regardless of the content or the result of the discussion. So rather than putting the brand forward, maybe we should just introduce the content or principles itself and ask them to incorporate if they like it. Like this, by, let's say, not highlighting that it is from OECD. We could have more chance to persuade other countries to join these ideas. Thank you.
I fully agree. I think that's a very good approach. We'll pass to Nigel for his comments.
Yes, thanks. And I know you want to wrap this up because we've got other recommendations to look at. In my opening remarks, I didn't really want to focus too much on the WICIT. Clearly, I completely agree with what my other panelists have said. I mean, the ITRs are for telecommunications, and if the discussion is on telecommunications, then clearly it's appropriate not to introduce these principles. I think my point was that wherever the internet is discussed, and I think we have to be pragmatic here. The internet is going to be discussed in various fora, because like the WICIT, you can't stop the internet being discussed. I mean, whether or not it should appear in the ITRs is a different question. But I think what I'm trying to say is that because these principles are so important, that we as ambassadors, if you like, for these principles, and having signed up to these principles, should be very aware of them when we are in discussing the internet in other fora. And I thoroughly agree that the second committee in the United Nations, which there is now a draft ICT resolution, we saw it overnight, and it is that, and some countries are calling, if you like, for a new structure, for a new way of discussing internet governance. And so it's in those sort of discussions that these principles play a very significant role, and we should be telling our administrations, if we're concerned about this, to ensure that in discussing the draft ICT resolution in the United Nations, that they take regard to these principles, not because they're OECD principles, but because they're principles that we all, abide by and think are important for freedom, economic growth, and innovation.
Do we have? Yes, Valerie.
Just a couple of thoughts on the various proposals to amend the ITRs. I mean, it's a extremely lengthy document, and various changes to the proposals are never ending. So if we, think about what are some of those proposals which are extremely detrimental to the internet economy and information society, I think we probably could distill it down to a couple of baskets or categories. I think one, it's extremely dangerous if the ITRs are expanded to include, in language or interpretation, the scope of ICTs, which could involve the processing of information. Secondly, given that a lot of the standards that are developed in the internet economy are really voluntary and based on the bottoms-up approach, any attempts to mandate technical standards within the ITRs are really detrimental. And lastly, attempts to regulate the international settlement rates for the exchange of internet traffic. There are also attempts to include other issues which may be subject to national sovereignty in the ITRs, and they are really not, good ideas or concepts. So I just wanted to be, to draw on some specifics in looking at the various baskets or categories of amendments that are being proposed to the discussion at WICET.
Thank you very much. My colleague Sam Paltridge pointed out that the OECD Internet Policy Principles were taken to APEC, and APEC, I think the wording was endorse the principles, broadening the consensus on these. So there is an effort for us to take these out as something that's been created by this large group surrounding the OECD's ecosystem, put it out, and have other organizations take this on board as input. I appreciate the discussions. If there are not any more comments, I don't see any hands go up, we'll move on to the second part of the second recommendation. So if we can, and this is on protecting children online. The recommendation on protecting children online is extremely important for us at the OECD, and it's broken down into three separate groupings of actions that government should take. So the first sets out a list of things that ways that we can protect children that involve all stakeholders, and these include the heading of empowerment, where we create a safer environment online for children, and that's a responsibility for everyone. One of the recommendation also talks about the importance of education and how it is the role of the parents to actually protect children, but that we provide the ability, stakeholders need to support parents in this work. We also talk about proportionality and fundamental values. So this is balancing exercises, setting the boundaries of children protection policies, and also focusing on the benefits and the openness of the internet, fundamental values on the internet such as freedom of expression. There is a trade-off. There can be a trade-off here, and we need to keep these things in balance when we talk about all stakeholders protecting children online. There's also flexibility in terms of age appropriateness and technological neutrality. So it's not just all stakeholders. There are certain things that governments can do domestically. And so these include taking leadership on this topic, actually bringing this up in domestic debates. There needs to be a coordination. This is not something the government can do by itself. There needs to be a coherent coordination among all stakeholders. It needs to be consistent, and it needs to be coherent. It's also important, governments can play a key role in raising awareness, helping people know about the tools that are available and what can be done. And also, when they do take policy decisions, make sure that these policy decisions are taken in a way that's based on sound policy and sound data. And then one of the key issues that also came out in this recommendation is the importance of having technologies that respect the freedom of others. So you can have tools available that protect children, but at the same time you need to have tools that let adults choose certain things for themselves. So parental controls need to be available. Then finally, there are certain things that need to be done at an international level that cannot be dealt with just domestically. And this includes leveraging existing good practices. So different governments need to get together and say, here's what we're doing. We've found that this works. This might be of interest to other countries in the region or around the world. We need to share information and evidence about what's going on. We also need to do capacity building, because this is something that's difficult for governments to get their hands around and actually work on. So we need to share and make sure that the capacity is there to do that across all countries of the world. And then we need to have coordination. There needs to be a dialogue, and there needs to be coordination across different fora. So those are the three key items, the three key categories that come out of the recommendation on protecting children online. I would actually like to begin by asking Mr. Nakaya if you could give us some perspective from Japan and your views on the recommendation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Reynolds. In fact, Japan sees it very important to establish a sound environment for youth and use internet safely and securely. Well, in light of this, government of Japan enacted a law concerning protection of youth online in year 2008. And on the same year, Japan put forward a proposal regarding youth protection online to OECD. And we are very happy to see that OECD adopted the Council recommendation on this matter this February. This resolution highlights its importance, as you mentioned, freedom of expression, the role of parents, and multi-stakeholder partnership, and also underlined a need to create a global index. And in advance to the adoption of this resolution, my institute, exactly saying my predecessor, started a research project to review the internet literacy of high school students in Japan, and released a report entitled Internet Literacy Assessment Indicator for Students this September. We already introduced key findings at the WPISP last month, and we'll keep you informed of the development of Japanese youth protection policies and measures. But if we have time, let me introduce some key findings here. It is based on a questionnaire and conducted in, let's say, 10 schools in Japan, and more than 2,500 students participated in this test. And after summarizing the result of the questionnaire, we found that students are relatively recognizing the risk. However, still there's a gap, and in particular, they're not so much aware of risk on security issues and privacy issues. Their recognition is relatively low. So we found a need to educate more so that students can learn how internet has a possibility to affect their personal security, and how internet could influence their privacy. And actually, we set out a guideline in consultation with stakeholders like parents, teacher associations, and internet service providers. And we are conducting a campaign with the support of these stakeholders at many schools in Japan. We formed a kind of caravan, consists of, let's say, school professors and some policymakers and sometimes internet providers, so that parents and students get together and understand how internet affects their life. And it's really successful, but still we have to make more effort to make them understand more, because to my surprise, there are many students, I mean high school students, who owns their own smartphone already. Approximately half of high school students have their own mobile phone. Let's say more than half of students. And half of students who has a mobile phone has smartphones. So now we have to inform them how smartphones are different from the mobile phone. In fact, in Japan, internet can be used freely and smoothly over the mobile phone. So it's a bit difficult to realize how the smartphones are different from mobile phone internet. So from technical point of view, it could be the responsibility of those stakeholders, including the government, to inform how it is different and how it affects the, let's say, personal information or personal data stored in the smartphones. And we are making effort to make a progress on it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there other members of the panel who'd be interested in commenting on this? Well, in the meantime, I think I'll jump in and say that I'm originally from the United States, and I follow the news from the United States while living abroad. And what seems to have gained a lot of attention, garnered a lot of attention in the United States recently, is cyberbullying and issues with how teenagers are using the internet and their mobile phone in particular. What's surprising to me as someone who does research in this field is that the youth are often thought of as the most technologically savvy group that we have. So, my own parents ask, the youngest child in the family, can you come over and help fix the computer? Can you do this? You know how to use the mobile phone. And there's almost an assumption that the teenagers get it and they understand. But what seems to be lacking is this maturity about the repercussions of some things that happen online. And you see that with some of the ways they use their mobile phones, or the things they post on the internet, on Facebook, on social networking sites, that there needs to be a real education here. And I think, and I can't speak for governments, but I think governments, the education system might think that the kids don't need this kind of training because they're already tech savvy. They know how to use the computer, they can do word processing, but this is something that needs to be addressed. Children need to understand the repercussions of what they do online and have the tools available to control some of that. So, are there any other? Can I open this up to the floor? Are there any other comments?
To a certain extent, there are probably varying degrees of things that can happen, in cyberspace that would warrant a protection of children or minors. Internet companies in the developing economies and the number in the Asia Pacific region often have faced a situation where child pornography, so cyber child pornography, takes place quite often simply because of the economics of trade, and in these countries where families are generally poor. Internet companies have, often come under some measure of criticism because in developing technologies, intermediary platforms, and social networks, it in a way facilitates these things from happening on the internet. What Microsoft has done a step further, in addition to reaching out to these communities and through, so for example, through schools, law enforcement, government, NGOs, is to also use technology and to develop technology that would help assist law enforcement and NGOs to prevent, such crimes from perpetrating on the internet. For example, we do have a technology called the photo DNA technology that is offered to law enforcement and NGOs to help them track images of these crimes and to remove them. So in a way, while technology does make it more important for us to reach out and to educate the community on some of the ills that can happen, technology can also be used to help remove and eradicate some of these crimes from happening on the web.
Thank you very much. Are there any other any remote participants that might want to chime in, or anyone from around here that would be interested in making a comment? Yes. We've got a mic here.
Louise Bennett, the Chartered Institute for IT. In the UK, we've had some very successful partnerships between schools, parents, students, and police to help people understand the problems of cyberbullying and similar things. I don't know if I can hear it sort of coming back at me. Can you hear it at all? And these will be very successful in educating young people and their parents about how to deal with things like cyberbullying and more serious things like child exploitation online. And so I would commend that as a good practice to use in other areas.
Any other comments before we close this discussion on this recommendation? Okay. Well, thank you very much. I think this has been very fruitful, and I've taken some good notes from the interventions. This has been great. We'll move on to the third recommendation, which is a recommendation on international mobile roaming services. We have with us Sam Paltridge, who heads the unit that works on infrastructure, telecommunications, and infrastructure at the OECD, and he's going to introduce this recommendation that they helped initiate on international mobile roaming services this year.
Thank you, Taylor. I guess most people who've come to this meeting are aware of the various issues around international mobile roaming. I don't know how many of you switched off your data roaming when you landed at the airport or on the way here, particularly if you're paying for that yourself. I got a text message from my operator when I landed that said that calls back to France would cost me nearly €3 per minute. And whereas I'm very pleased with my operator in France and generally think they give me a great service. I'm not entirely happy with prices like that when I go internationally, particularly these days with smartphones, where if you own a smartphone, I think most people realize that the applications that you have on that smartphone are probably most useful when you're traveling internationally. And with applications like maps that sometimes use quite a bit of data, basically if you're paying extraordinary amounts for that service, it doesn't really make it very useful. So OECD countries have been observing trends in international mobile roaming for quite a few years, and basically I think there was growing concern that the market wasn't working effectively. We just weren't seeing the normal market disciplines applied in this area that we see in, for the most part, very competitive domestic markets. And so before I just introduce the Council recommendation, I thought I'd put up just 2 slides which highlight this. And I apologise a little because these slides weren't developed for this presentation. They're just simply to show you some differences in pricing for international mobile services around the world. And I'm sorry, Nigel, I've picked on the UK, but I could have really put up any OECD country and you wouldn't have different results. But if you look at the prices shown in yellow there, they're for China Mobile. For China Mobile users coming to, in this case, the UK, and either making a local call in the UK or calling home or sending a text message. And I've put the corresponding prices, and I picked T-Mobile and Orange, both operators in the UK, and for their customers going to China and making the same calls in the reverse direction or a local call. And they're the differences in the prices. So, you know, OECD countries face a number of challenges, particularly due to the global financial crisis, and they're very concerned about the competitiveness of the services that are on offer for business and consumers. And we look at comparisons like this and we say, well, this is not what we used to in OECD countries. We want competitive outcomes, we want the competitive outcomes from the market, and we don't think we're getting them. So could I just go to the next slide? So this tells a similar story, but so many people at the IGF or other ICT meetings put up slides where they show that developing countries are far behind OECD countries. Pick whatever metric you like, I don't care. The developed countries are generally ahead, way ahead. So what I thought I'd do here is just highlight international mobile roaming as an area where, in fact, developing countries are far ahead, and in some regions are far more competitive than OECD countries. And there's been an interesting development in African countries where they've had cross-border roaming. You can go from, you know, the example here I've used is from Ghana to Nigeria, and it's included in your basic tariff, whether you're a prepaid or a postpaid user. And I think, yes, no, can we go back? It's included in your basic tariff, so if you go to the neighbouring country, there's no difference in the pricing. You pay the same price if you make a call while you're roaming in Nigeria as what you'd pay in Ghana. What's even more interesting is if you make a third country call to, say, the United States. So if you went from Ghana to Nigeria and then called the United States, it's also extremely inexpensive. And you can see the prices there. For what I've done here is compare the prices for an Orange customer in the UK going to France, a neighbouring country, with someone from Ghana going to Nigeria. And again, you can see tremendous differences, and we can explore why those differences may be in the discussion if you like. So just 2 examples there of where I think OECD countries the results we're getting are extremely uncompetitive with the rest of the world. So if I could now go to the Council recommendations. So faced by this, we had a process within OECD countries at our meetings where we discussed these developments. And the first step was to benchmark prices all across the OECD area and to see where those prices were at, and then to track them over a couple of years. So we did successive reports on this, and generally I can say that our member governments weren't happy with what they saw in that benchmarking. We also looked at international data roaming, and although we saw more promise for more competitive outcomes in data roaming for various reasons, we still saw extremely high prices. And we started to see, first in the European area, but then successively in a number of other OECD countries, people start to put in place bilateral or multilateral agreements. And I think those of you from the European area will know of the actions taken by the European Union, where they've actually regulated wholesale and retail prices. But also we see agreements across the world. Some of them are just memorandum of understanding that we should cooperate more on international roaming. Some of them go further than that and direct operators to reduce tariffs, and there's agreements between countries such as Singapore and Malaysia that do that. And there's other countries such as Australia and New Zealand that are examining what they may do in this area. And you get a lot of interesting discussion about how compatible that is with WTO and so forth. But it's clearly a trend that if the markets aren't going to react in a way we would expect, that governments will step in. Now, what we wanted to do in the Council recommendation was provide, and Rohan, my colleague here, likes to use the word menu. So we put in a recommendation. I haven't put the whole recommendation obviously on the slide because it won't fit onto one slide, but there's 10 points, and I've tried to summarize them there in a smaller number. But basically it's a gradated approach. So it starts from step 1, which is about consumer education, telling consumers what the options are, going to step 2, which is make sure there's transparency about international roaming, make sure consumers have options when they can control their expenditure when they go internationally, right up to recommendations 7, 8, 9, 10, which, if you like, have more teeth in terms of regulatory outcomes, right up to actually regulating, as in the European Union area, wholesale and retail roaming prices. So that is basically, in a nutshell, what we've done in the area of international roaming. It's a menu for governments to select what actions they would like to take if they're not happy with the prices that are available for their consumers, if they think they're not competitive with other parts of the world, and if they think that this is affecting trade and travel, and basically to help their economies develop going forward. So Taylor, I'll hand back to you as the moderator, and I know Rohan would like to comment. Perhaps we go straight to Rohan, and then I guess we open it up for anyone else who'd like to comment.
Thank you. In the spirit of keeping the focus, I suppose we'll have to first ask why we are talking about roaming at the IGF. Because when people think of roaming, they think of voice calls, which is old-style telephony. But I think it is correct to talk about roaming at the IGF, because today, increasingly with the proliferation of smartphones, people are using their smartphones wherever they go, and it is actually quite illogical to sort of have to switch off data roaming in strange cities, because that's exactly when you want the various conveniences that your map program and various other things give you. So it seems somewhat sort of insane, in my opinion, for operators not to accommodate our need to actually use the functionalities that are in our phones. But then, you know, I mean, insanity is not limited to telephone operators. I have never understood why hotels have set telephone charges for people staying in their rooms at extraordinarily high amounts all these years, when we have been bypassing them in various ways, using our mobiles, using payphones, using whatever, and when they could have got our money if they were actually pricing in a reasonable manner. But basically, we have been interested in roaming, and we have done quite a bit of work looking at roaming prices, particularly in South Asia. And I investigated why these roaming prices are very high and why the market doesn't work. The way it is basically a bilateral monopoly where each company agrees to rip off the other company's customers. So basically, company A goes to company B in another country and says, how much do you want? And that company says, we want an enormous amount, an unreasonable amount. You say yes. In return, company B asks the other company, how much do you want? And they also say yes. So they mutually exploit each other's customers. And, you know, the various companies and organizations that pay roaming bills subsidize this extortion. And the rest of us basically do suboptimal optimizations like carrying SIMs from other countries and so on and so forth. But you know, that menu, for example, that's in the OECD menu, and it's not something that should be included, in my opinion. Because for voice, even for voice, it gave a suboptimal solution in the sense that you could make calls, but you couldn't receive calls from the people calling you. So I find myself, for example, when I'm in India, walking around with two phones because I want to be reached, but I also want to reach. So on one phone I do this, on the other phone I do that, and I get very confused, and you know, that's really not an optimal solution. And you can imagine how suboptimal it is when you're doing data. That's really not a solution. So when I look at the situation with regard to roaming, I see almost two extremes. Something that Sam mentioned, which is now what is offered by the company called Airtel, Bharti Airtel in Africa. This was actually an innovation put together by a company called Zain that later got taken over. What they do is, irrespective of anybody else, they simply allow, they have licenses in multiple countries, and they simply allow their customers to be treated like national customers in other countries. So that is why those numbers that Sam showed were so low. So when the Ghana customer is in Nigeria, they are being treated like a Nigerian customer. And they can, for example, load their phones, because remember, my people are mostly running on prepaid. We are a think tank focusing on the bottom of the pyramid. So we are all running on prepaid. And on prepaid cards, you can even load up your card in Nigeria when you're roaming, like just buying some value from Ghana or Nigeria and putting it onto your card, and it'll still be recognized. There are some issues here. Actually, this was designed originally to prevent churn, to keep hold of their customers, in a way in opposition to the M-Pesa effort on the part of their competitors in Kenya. So it's not a fully comprehensive solution. And strangely, I suppose, the company that is doing this stuff in Africa doesn't do this in its home territory of South Asia in a uniform way. Now the other extreme, of course, for those who like government intervention, is Singapore, Malaysia, where the two countries have agreed that in the interests of greater integration and so on within ASEAN, and remember the logic has to come from something other than telecom. The logic has to come from the larger regionalization imperatives. They have decided to mutually bring down the retail prices that are charged. That, I suppose, can be done by various country pairs. The third option, which sort of I favor, is an old American technique called jawboning. I have no idea why it is called jawboning, but I remember it because I used to teach American policy to Americans at one point in my life. And I kind of like these quaint terms. It sticks in your mind. You have no idea what it is, but jawboning. Jawboning means that policymakers and regulators just talk about something endlessly. They talk about something. You know, sort of Luigi Gambardella talking about sending party network pays, right? I mean, he just talks about it endlessly. And some action will result somewhere in the system. Somebody's default will shift from wherever it was. So here, what I generally am recommending is that we as think tanks, policy advocates, etc., and governments sort of talk about roaming. And as you go and sort of harass these people and engage them in debate and publicly shame them and so on, which I do frequently to phone companies in my region, they are beginning, actually, I'm beginning to see them moving towards something a little more reasonable than their present unreasonable behavior. And they're beginning to see, for example, my own company has given me a bunch of countries where they give me sort of one country, one price for my data, where I just sign on to their package, and for X megabytes, they'll charge me a reasonable amount in different countries, addressing, in fact, some of the transparency issues that are quite problematic. Because, to understand roaming, you need an app. I mean, honestly, you don't need a table, you don't need graphics, you need an application to do computing and advise you, because it's so non-transparent and opaque. So I think in the spirit of good old jawboning, we should jawbone about this some more. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rohan. Very interesting. I saw that on the teleprompter it was saying, job own, like owning a job, but it's actually jawbone, the bone of your jaw here. So it's very good. It looks like it's correct now. And I don't know where it comes from myself. As an American, you can teach me.
I guess your jaws hurt after you do this.
So much.
Yeah.
Maybe that's it. Okay. We have about 11 minutes left. So are there, and I'd like to get you out before 12:30, because since you've sacrificed to come here, we'll get you to the lunch line early. So are there any comments or questions on this from the audience first? And we'll go with that, and then we'll have just a quick roundup from the panelists. If I can just say one thing. First thing we did when we arrived here, we knew that data roaming would be so expensive that we stopped in the airport and we spent about 40 minutes or so getting SIM cards, local SIM cards to put in our phones. And luckily we were able to do that here in Azerbaijan, but otherwise this is an area that really needs to be addressed. So it doesn't look like we have any comments on this. Could we, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I found your presentation most interesting, and what I'm saying is not really anything to do with ICANN, but that's never stopped me before. But simply really as an observation, and a personal observation, I was involved since 2006 in negotiating the European roaming regulations. There's now 3 roaming regulations that have come out of the European Union. This was, to many of us, I think, a fairly radical move by the European Union to create a roaming regulation. Perhaps the second and the third weren't that radical, but certainly the first was radical. The very fact that we'd intervene in terms of retail prices for roaming services. But what came out of that exercise was just to show how difficult the process is. I mean, not just difficult from, if you like, a political point of view, because I think there was goodwill on all sides, including that of the operators, to try and reach an equitable solution, but just the actual sort of difficulty in the way the market works. And I'm sure I haven't been involved in these particular discussions, but I'm sure when the OECD were formulating these recommendations, they recognised that the economics of this are not simple, and of course the agreements that the operators have vary enormously. Some operators have agreements with an awful lot of different operators, and some operators don't. Some operators can form alliances. They have the market power, they have the size to form, like the Vodafones and the France Telecoms, to form alliances in a great many countries, and therefore being able to sort of lower roaming prices is somewhat easier. I'm not saying it's trivial for them either. So I think it is difficult. The point I think that's important here is obviously the transparency, is obviously the competition, is to allow people to understand what prices what rates they face when they visit other countries, and I think that's fundamental both for data and for voice. People need to be able to have the choice, and I think as people do have the choice, and as we found here, I mean, in terms of the Wi-Fi, increasingly the operators will well, the Wi-Fi is good when it works, isn't it? Come on. Increasingly the operators will recognise, as they have in the European Union and I'm sure elsewhere, that they have to lower roaming prices to stop people turning off their 3G and going on to Wi-Fi, because and so, well, I think eventually there might be some and just finally, on the slide with China and the UK, not that I'm protectionist or whatever, but presumably what that slide indicates is the fact that people from China dialing out from the UK back to China are getting cheap rates from UK operators, where the inverse is not true coming out of China. Thank you.
The short answer to that is when I speak to the Chinese government, they tell me that the Chinese operators have successfully negotiated very low wholesale rates, and we've got about 20 or so OECD countries and a couple of other countries such as Singapore where China Mobile has obviously negotiated very low wholesale rates, or there is conceivably a way that they might do it by balancing traffic in the opposite direction, but generally you do not charge lower retail rates than wholesale rates. So logically you would infer from that they have negotiated lower wholesale rates. The question then is, why hasn't the market reacted in the opposite direction for the UK operators to lower their tariffs? And I don't want to make this necessarily a UK example, because I could point the finger at any OECD country and I'd get the same result, that consumers going in the opposite direction are in fact paying high rates. And there's one other American word that I hesitate to introduce into the discussion, but it's whipsawing, which is again is a,
How do you spell that?
I'll say it slowly with an Australian accent. Whipsawing. But effectively, we haven't seen whipsawing, at least much. Well,
Different part of America.
perhaps Tad with an American accent could pronounce it, but we haven't seen whipsawing much since the old days with accounting rates, where the first countries that introduced competition realised that if you had, say, 3 operators in a country and you were negotiating with one operator in a country, that one operator could play off the 3 operators while still offering a single rate in the opposite direction. And if you have some types of government intervention, which we're now seeing in Ghana and Congo, in Pakistan, where the government is coming in and saying you must pay this termination charge, and if they extend that to international roaming, and they may not do it openly, but they may do that behind closed doors, then you may get a situation of whipsawing, and Rohan may like to quickly comment on whipsawing.
Okay, I'll just point out we have 4 minutes left, so
Okay.
if you can keep it
Can
quick.
I'll just combine everything. I'm quite intrigued by the Chinese example. I think, I don't have to be diplomatic. That's why I like what I do. So the non-diplomatic explanation is, A, the UK operators are stupid, and they didn't negotiate a lower wholesale termination rate from the Chinese. That is one possibility. Or B, they are very clever, extremely clever, and they negotiated a lower wholesale rate, and they're keeping the retail high and keeping the difference. And making, their customers are sort of traumatized about roaming anyway, so they're keeping the difference. They're keeping it at comparable levels and making huge profits from people roaming in China. Those are the two possibilities. But anyway, I think, this sort of reflects, in a way, the beauty and the, I'm just trying to wrap up, whatever comments you want me to make. These kinds of issues, I think, reflect the sort of the unique strengths and weaknesses of IGF, where in one sense, almost everything can be brought into this discussion, including mobile voice and so on, which shouldn't really be part of IGF discussions. But that's the way the internet is going. The internet is becoming a very broad tent. And in my opinion, it is better that we talk about these things in these kinds of settings, where no treaty obligations are concluded, and that we get rid of things like Wicket. In my opinion, the best thing to do about the Wicket conference is to cancel it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rohan. Valerie, do you have any final comments?
Thank you, Taylor. I was a bit kind of tempted to just make this comment, since we're at IGF and talking about things that are related to the internet. In this discussion on international mobile roaming services, I was just wondering, a consideration could be in the age of IP traffic and the internet, whether discussion on the prices and the substitutability of other voice type internet enabled applications like Skype, for example, Viber, Fring. There are a lot of voice enabled internet applications. How do they feature in these discussions, and the consumer choices that are put in the table for consumers to decide, irrespective of the pricing and availability, the use of these other substitute services?
Just quickly, I'd say I think that's helping drive down prices overall for roaming, is the workarounds. So, okay, Nigel, do you have any final comments? Okay, Mr. Nakayama, no. Okay, well, with that, I'd like to thank our participants for coming to the meeting, and I'd like to thank everyone here for coming and breaking away from the session. I thought it was a very good discussion, and now I hope you can rush and get something to eat in the next few minutes. Thank you very much. Goodbye.